101. The Arrival of Vampires. Arthur had already found Michael by the time the injured man crawled into the room. The house elf, Baru, had not sounded any alarm. That absence of warning told him two things at once. Something had happened to Baru, and Michael had not stumbled in by chance. He had come deliberately. Someone was targeting the Delacour household, and more likely than not, Arthur himself. Worse, the attackers were no ragtag crew. Whoever had been able to neutralize a house elf in silence was powerful, probably an elite even among aurors. House elves were resilient, and their small frames made them difficult targets for charm work. To strike one silently suggested a highly skilled hand. Realizing they were facing a major threat, Arthur had Fleur wake Gabrielle and led them to a room with a better defensive position at the end of the third-floor corridor. There they sealed doors and windows to deny any sneak attacks. Fleur set to work transfiguring the furniture. Arthur was no ordinary prodigy, but Fleur was formidable in her own right. Top of her year at Beauxbatons, with transfiguration skills that even wizards a couple of grades above her might envy. She swept her wand in a series of practiced motions. Window panes became wooden planks. Other furnishings were altered so that floors and walls were temporarily strengthened. By the time she finished, she was leaning against the wall, spent. At 16, she had already built substantial magical reserves, but the effort had drained her. Arthur, meanwhile, transformed several pieces of furniture into jagged spikes and arranged them at the main entrance as a crude barricade. Then he raised his wand and sent a single red flare into the Parisian sky, a signal to nearby wizards. That flare, however, also drew attention from the vampires nearby. They did not wait for reinforcements. The vampires inside the house surged up toward the third floor. Michael, wounded, was crawling toward the stairwell and hiding behind a sofa. The vampires found him without difficulty. "Pfft," Michael spat, then forced himself to speak to the leader. "I'm with Lucy. She's a Deathwalker. We're on the same side, brother." Deathwalkers were the vampires' specialist corps, typically assigned to hunt werewolves. Analogous to the aurors among wizards, they were selected for strength and ruthlessness. The vampire in command laughed. "Lucy's man? You should know. Because she failed to watch you, she's been locked away by the elders." The leader's smile widened into a sneer. "My name is Klein. I'm from the council, one level above the Deathwalkers." Vampire society was rigid and formal. At the top sat 3 elders. The Grand Elder was Marcus, the son of Alexander Corvinus, the progenitor of modern vampires, but Marcus lay in prolonged slumber for reasons of longevity. The other 2 elders handled most affairs. Beneath the elders sat the council, then the Deathwalkers as an enforcement arm, and below them ordinary vampires and the extended bloodlines. That hierarchy gave the vampires a collective advantage when dealing with werewolves. On hearing the name of the council, Michael's face fell. He had spent long enough among vampires to know his fate: captivity, unending experiments. His unique physiology, part vampire, part werewolf, made him a prize, and perhaps a creature who could not be killed. Despair replaced hope. Klein's grin widened as his men bound Michael. Capturing a hybrid like this could elevate his standing within the council, perhaps push him toward becoming an elder. One of his underlings called up from below. "Boss, there are 3 more on the 3rd floor. They look like wizards. Our men won't go in." Klein's expression hardened. "Wizards have held us down for years. With Michael, that changes. Once we understand how he absorbs werewolf blood, we'll make Paris a city of vampires. Why fear 3 wizards? Go, infect them. Make them feel what it means to be bound to the bloodline." He slapped the subordinate for good measure and led his force upstairs. Far away, Grindelwald lowered his wand with a satisfied air. He had slipped a little influence into Klein earlier, making the man more quick to wrath. On the 3rd floor, Arthur heard the commotion downstairs and felt the threat narrowing toward them. He produced a small fragment of the Philosopher's Stone and sighed. He had used a fragment against Professor Bernhard the vampire not long ago, out of fear his own magic would not suffice. It had been overkill. Bernhard had not been worth the expenditure. This time he took only a sliver. Still, the tally bothered him. In less than half a month, he had burned through 2 fragments. The scarcity tightened his chest. With his wand in his left hand and the stone fragment in his right, he shielded Fleur and Gabrielle behind him. Fleur grabbed his arm, voice sharp with concern. Arthur, we're wizards. Vampires have been wary of attacking us. If they come for us, you take Gabrielle and run. I'll hold them off. To her, Arthur was still 3 years her junior. The difference a child's world often widened into a gulf of power. Arthur pulled her into an embrace. Don't worry. Trust me, Fleur. You know I wouldn't do anything unless I was sure I could. He raised his wand and began the incantation for a soul guardian. Last time he had called upon a thunder giant to finish Bernhard, an instant, brutal solution that wasted excess magical energy. Facing a larger number of foes now, he chose more prudently. A unicorn-shaped soul guardian, steadier and far less costly, would be the instrument to face the tide of vampires coming for them. Arthur stood at the front of the room, the unicorn horn wand in his left hand, its tip set with a shining ruby. He crushed the ruby fragment in his right hand. A rush of power ran through him and focused into the gem at the wand's tip. He concentrated and began to chant. The tip of the wand flared with a blue-white light that brightened until it was like a star rising in the midnight sky. The air itself stirred as the enormous magic converged. Fleur, who was standing behind him, was stunned. She hadn't realized her younger brother, 3 years her junior, had grown so strong. Even channeled through a magical artifact like the ruby, the power Arthur displayed was greater than any spell she had seen a professor use at school. A bolt of lightning leapt from the wand's tip and tore through the night. The silver stream coalesced before Arthur into a huge winged unicorn. Pure white with a faint blue glow, its body shimmering with crystalline light. White currents of energy coiled around its horn and down its flanks, making the air crackle. Its outstretched wings spanned nearly 10 meters. The feathers were so detailed they could have been real, and the crackling lightning along them made them razor-sharp. A mere brush could score the walls. After summoning the Soul Guardian, Arthur split his remaining magic. Half went into transfiguring nearby objects into 3 massive shields to guard them. The other half he held back for the hidden enemy. His transfiguration wasn't perfect, but he had plenty of power, and the more he poured in, the stronger the shields became. Transfiguration was often more useful than defensive charms because charms typically only guarded against magical attacks, not physical ones. That was why transfiguration ranked alongside charms, and why masters like Dumbledore and McGonagall excelled at it. Against vampires, the conjured shields would be especially practical. With the Soul Guardian standing watch, Arthur stepped back to Fleur's side and drew Gabrielle behind them. He smiled and asked, "How about that? Confident I can handle a vampire now?" Fleur flushed. "Humph, why didn't you tell me sooner? How was I to know you were like this?" Seeing the unicorn had made her feel as if she'd been corrected in class. A professor had proven her wrong. "You could have told me." "You didn't say anything in your letter," he said. "You only wrote you were top of your year and studying alchemy. I figured you were about my level." She hugged him from behind and murmured, "I know you've gone through things before. Now that I'm older, you don't have to keep everything to yourself. Even if I can't help, I can at least listen." Arthur tilted his head back and patted her hand. "I know. I promise I will, from now on." At their age, girls often matured faster. Fleur's figure had filled out, and Arthur's small gesture felt intimate. She blushed but didn't pull away. Gabrielle, pressed behind them, was watching the unicorn with wide, shining eyes. She didn't know how dangerous vampires were, but she could read the room. Her sister had been terrified moments ago, and now was relaxing enough for quiet talk. Still, Gabrielle's curiosity about the unicorn won out. She tugged Arthur's sleeve. "Arthur," she asked, "what kind of magic is that? Can you teach me? I want one." Fleur's look made Gabrielle shiver and let go of his hand, but Arthur didn't notice. He crouched and ruffled her hair like a child. "I'll teach you later. Whether you can summon one is another matter." Gabrielle nodded eagerly. The sounds on the staircase grew louder. The vampires had caught up. Arthur and Fleur slid Gabrielle to the back, the 3 shields forming a protective triangle around them. The door was kicked open, and several vampires surged in, but they froze at the sight of the mercurial, winged unicorn. If vampires had any natural enemies besides wizards, unicorns were near the top. A vampire could never survive drinking unicorn blood. They would starve forever before touching it. No one, not even wizards, recklessly sought unicorn blood. Klein, who was in the shadow behind the attackers, blinked at the apparition. Once he registered the wings and the ethereal form, he understood. This was wizardry. He slapped the front-rank vampires and cursed, "Idiots! This is magic! When have you ever seen a winged unicorn?" Then Klein stepped forward, sized up Arthur and the others, pointed at the Guardian and sneered, "You really think some trinket like that can handle a pack of vampires? Overconfident, aren't you? Still, all three of you look tasty. I'll enjoy turning you myself." Arthur had no time for Klein's theatrics. He wasn't worried about the pawns. Whoever lurked in the dark and ordered this attack was his real concern. If it were only these vampires, he would have dealt with them already. He twitched his wand, and the unicorn obeyed, moving on his command. The vampires reacted with predictable recklessness. Some lunged at the unicorn. Others, including Klein, charged the trio. That was their mistake. Wizards had suppressed vampires for as long as either species had records, and Arthur had prepared for this. Shields slammed into the oncoming vampires with the force of a truck. Several vampires were hurled through the air, their bones shattered on impact. Klein was driven into the wall and stuck there, stunned. Those who touched the unicorn fared worse. Their bodies convulsed, an arcane affliction unfurled, and within moments they began to emit an odor. Charlotte, the remnant soul of the unicorn bound in Arthur's wand, took over the Soul Guardian. The creature didn't hold back. It tore through them mercilessly. After a few brutal stamps, most of the attackers were reduced to smoking, charred corpses, the air filled with the smell of roasted meat. Gabrielle, hiding at the back, sniffed and licked her lips at the scent. Only 2 vampires and Michael managed to escape. Klein, pinned in the wall, stared at Arthur with a new fear in his eyes. "You're a devil. No, you can't kill me," he stammered. Arthur's interest piqued. "You think I can't kill you? Why not? Do you have some treasure?" The unicorn lowered its head and fixed Klein with its horn. The vampire swallowed and forced a claim. "Yes, treasure. Galleons, many galleons, tens of thousands. I'm a member of the Vampire Council. Apart from the 3 elders, my rank is the highest. Killing me will bring you nothing but trouble." Arthur's face darkened. He could feel the insult in Klein's words. "Tens of thousands of galleons? You think I'd be impressed? Which wizard needs money that badly? My vaults are full enough to make little mountains, and you imagine your rank buys you protection? Then why didn't you realize I was a wizard before you came sniffing around? Can't you tell who runs the magical world? No wonder you lot were driven out by the werewolves up in the Northlands." When Klein realized the little wizards in front of him would not let him go, he opened his mouth and screamed. The high, piercing sound made Arthur frown, and that was the opening Arthur needed to seize control of the vampire corpses scattered across the floor. Those corpses were Arthur's subordinates. He had long ago stored blood in their bodies so that, even after death, he could manipulate it through his own magic. The scream affected Arthur and the others, but not Charlotte. Charlotte was only a soul right now. Physical attacks had no effect on her. So when Klein screamed, the unicorn she controlled answered immediately with a crushing stomp. The impact ripped the floor out from under Klein and threw him down to the level below. Klein managed to grip the blood in the fallen vampire corpses with one hand as he fell, dragging it with him. Arthur did not pursue Charlotte. He held his shield up, watching for any mastermind who might be lurking in the shadows and ready to strike. The unicorn Charlotte controlled was enough to handle Klein. On the second floor, Klein at first considered running, but the glowing unicorn kept on his heels. Desperate, he used the blood he'd brought with him to build 3 thick barriers between himself and the creature. He had no idea what this conjured unicorn was, an illusory beast, a monster that could not be harmed by ordinary attacks. A single gentle kick from it made him retch half a liter of blood. The unicorn closed in. Klein kept summoning more blood walls to stall, wishing he had a blood slave to buy him time. He envied wizards. They were the strongest beings in the magic world. A wizard could summon a creature and crush an enemy from hundreds of meters away. Vampires practiced blood magic, but it was limited. Their range was small, and their options were few. If only he could make a simple barrier and then dig his way out, find other vampires outside and escape. Michael, his target, had already been taken away. As long as Klein himself survived, the loss of his subordinates wouldn't ruin him. Before he could act, the unicorn changed tactics. Earlier, on the upper floor, Charlotte had only had the unicorn perform simple stomps, no need for excessive force where Arthur and the others were nearby. Now, in the more open space of the second floor, she needed to finish this stronger-than-average vampire quickly. The unicorn watched the blood wall ahead of it, then spread its wings. White arcs of electricity began to dance along its plumage, lightning crackled on its horn. As the arcs converged, the horn blazed into a spear of light, like a knight raising a lance. A chaotic, metallic buzzing rose from it, like the chorus of 1,000 birds, and the whole room seemed to tighten around that sound. The unicorn pawed twice, then charged. Its hooves beat the floor in a dull thunder that made the building shudder. The horn's glow grew until the room was bathed in harsh daylight-bright light. That light cut through the layers of blood and stabbed into Klein's eyes. The horn struck the blood barrier with a shriek. The walls of blood cracked in an instant, and under the impact, shattered like glass, slumping back into red liquid. The unicorn burst through the makeshift defenses, and its electrified horn plunged into Klein's chest. He watched, unable to believe it. The impact tore him forward. The unicorn smashed through the second-floor wall and hoisted him into the air. When his hands brushed the lightning on the horn, his limbs went numb. Blood poured from the wound, and his vision blurred. His thoughts slid away as consciousness faded. "Merlin's beard! What is this?" Someone shouted from outside. Mr. Delacour stood below, staring up at his battered house and the human body the unicorn held on the ruined second-floor wall. He had been working overtime because of the recent chaos, vampires and werewolves running wild. A pack of werewolves had, inexplicably, taken to climbing the Eiffel Tower in Paris and biting people. The team had been swamped. When he saw lights flashing at his own place on the tower, he'd sprinted back, terrified for his daughter. Now he saw carnage and screamed at the sight. Fleur, on the third floor, stuck her head out of the window. "Dad, you're back!" Mr. Delacour's face was grim. "If I hadn't come back myself, there might not have been a house left. What happened here?" He pushed past Fleur's window and looked down into the room. The blood soaked across the floor, and the corpse beside the unicorn told him immediately this was the work of a vampire, an elite vampire, one capable of controlling great quantities of blood. When he climbed to the third floor, the dozen corpses scattered by the staircase made him think for a moment that he'd walked into a Muggle battlefield. He'd never seen so much slaughter in the magical world. Ignoring the bodies, he rushed to the room where Fleur had shown herself. Only when he saw Fleur and Gabrielle alive and unhurt did he allow himself to breathe. He turned to Arthur. "Arthur, you're not hurt, are you?" Before Arthur could answer, Fleur cut him off. "Of course nothing happened, Papa. You have no idea how powerful Arthur is. Dozens of vampires attacked us at once, and he cleared them all by himself. I only reinforced the room a little. It hardly did anything." She looked at Gabrielle with eyes full of adoration and pride. "Gabrielle, right?" Exactly. Arthur is amazing. He protected me and my sister all on his own," Gabrielle agreed, sharing the same proud glow as Fleur, as if she had been fighting alongside him. Mr. Delacour listened, torn between relief and a strange, possessive irritation. He was grateful Arthur had saved his daughters. Had he been there, he might only have fled with them. But seeing his girls beam at Arthur as if he had taken something from him made him uneasy. Fleur's parting line, "You simply don't understand, Arthur," stung more than he expected. Arthur stepped forward then, taking Fleur's hand. "Mr. Delacour, it's what I should do," he said calmly. Grindelwald, watching from a distance, was far less composed. He hadn't expected Arthur to be so formidable without using dark arts. The summoned unicorn's assault had been as destructive as fiend fire and far more agile. The dozens of vampires Arthur dispatched were like helpless fowl at the mercy of a battering ball. Arthur moved through them with apparent ease, and even seemed to have energy left over. Grindelwald's plan had been thrown off. Arthur had revealed himself to the wizarding world tonight, but not as the heir to the Dark Lord. He risked becoming famous as the next Dumbledore. Even Grindelwald, or Dumbledore in his youth, might not have matched Arthur's power now. At the same age, perhaps neither of them combined could defeat him. Grindelwald took a long breath. He had not come away empty-handed. From his examination of Bernhard's body, he noticed a common thread in Arthur's two recent battles: lightning magic. The difference was that last time it had been dark. This time it had not. That suggested Arthur had developed two branches of magic stemming from some form of lightning. That gave Grindelwald a way to estimate Arthur's dark arts level. Useful information. In the end, whether Arthur used dark arts or not mattered little to Grindelwald's larger schemes. The true question was whether Arthur could be turned to his side, which would infuriate Dumbledore. He did not want Arthur becoming like Newt, absorbing Dumbledore's attention, though watching the young man now, Grindelwald convinced himself Arthur was neither as guileless nor as easily deceived as Newt. Still, things had deviated from his plan, and he was annoyed. He drained his wine, tossed the glass aside, and walked off. By the time Mr. Delacour returned, aurors from the French Ministry of Magic had arrived. They had been handling the werewolves earlier, and when news came that vampires were also involved, they rushed in, breathless. Charlotte, on Arthur's orders, had already laid Klein's body down. Arthur dispelled the Soul Guardian charm, and the aurors regretted that they hadn't seen the unique form of the summoned unicorn for themselves. Relieved that the vampires had been neutralized, the auror team led by Ferrus Spavin, the French Minister for Magic, began triaging the scene. They quickly sent the wounded aurors away for treatment. It hadn't been a full moon, so the werewolves' transformations hadn't carried the ability to turn wizards into werewolves. That said, anyone scratched or bitten by a werewolf would now be prone to werewolf-like symptoms in the future. Wounds exposed to full moonlight would flare painfully. Tonight had been a catastrophe for Paris, worse in some ways than the great conflagration Grindelwald had set decades ago. Streets the werewolves had roamed were ruined. The material damage was immense. Worse were the long-term consequences. More than 10 aurors had been bitten and would suffer the after-effects for life. Over 20 wizards were injured. Even more muggles had been hurt. Early estimates suggested at least 100 people killed by the werewolves and thousands injured, and those numbers would rise as more reports came in. That tally didn't yet include the casualties caused by the vampires. When Ferrus Spavin learned Arthur had dealt with the vampires, he warmly shook his hand and thanked him again and again until he embarrassed himself into stopping. On the matter of Arthur killing so many vampires, Spavin considered it an act of self-defense to protect others. In his view, the lives of vampires did not carry the same weight as those of wizards, and since the vampires had struck first, Arthur's actions were justified. Spavin even planned to award Arthur a medal. Meanwhile, as the aurors combed the battlefield, one of them recognized the fallen vampire. This is Kleine, by Merlin's Eiffel Tower," another asked. "Who's Kleine?" "He's the vampire most likely to become an elder after the current council's term ends. Right now, only the 3 great vampire elders could command him. In our system, he'd equate to a director at the ministry, the kind with the prestige to be a minister someday." "Ah, will there be trouble for killing him?" That exchange drew the minister's attention. On hearing it, Ferrus Spavin bristled. "He was a vampire," he said without hesitation. "Even if we killed a vampire progenitor, it's no crime. Who gave these creatures the nerve to attack wizards? Tomorrow I will demand an explanation from their council." Spavin was a hardliner. He had long despised werewolves, vampires, and other dark beings. He had tolerated vampires' customary restraint for the sake of diplomacy, but tonight's violence changed everything. He had been thinking of retiring next year and had no desire to let the situation blow up, but the press would not forgive inaction. Public opinion might turn against him if he looked weak. He was grateful to Arthur, but Arthur was British, not French. If Spavin failed to act decisively, his retirement might not be voluntary. 105. French Ministry of Magic. Medal of Honor. By the next day, the werewolf and vampire atrocities in Paris had already hit the front pages of major newspapers. Other countries reported the incident as well. What worried wizards most was not simply that news of the attack had spread within the wizarding world, but that it had leaked to the Muggle press. Some Muggles had taken photographs during the attacks. Even after aurors had erased their memories, the images remained, and the phrase, "this is real," echoed in their minds. The pictures had appeared so suddenly and looked so realistic that they rapidly became lead stories in Muggle papers. More Muggles came forward, claiming to have seen creatures that matched legends of werewolves and vampires, and a few who had been scratched by werewolves began showing symptoms of lycanthropy. Those reports were direct, undeniable evidence. In the United States, the magical exposure threat level clock already pointed to its highest setting, an unexplainable severe situation. The incident had escalated to an international crisis. 3 days after the events in Paris, representatives from the various ministries of magic convened in the city to discuss what to do. Extermination was not an option. Even if aurors from every ministry worked together, they could not wipe out 2 entire races. Werewolves, for example, were largely driven into cold, harsh areas of northern Europe. As long as they hid there, wizards could not find them. Any attempt to annihilate them would only push the problem underground and invite a bloody retaliation. Under these circumstances, the council splintered into opposing factions, arguing heatedly. It seemed a resolution would be at least 10 days to 2 weeks away. Arthur had no voice at that council. He was not yet qualified to represent Britain's wizards. But he found himself pulled into the aftermath in another way. Ferris Spavin, minister of the French Ministry of Magic, kept his promise and made time to present Arthur with an honorary medal in person. The French ministry had already publicized Arthur's role in the previous day's newspapers, how he had killed dozens of vampires to protect his friends and driven the vampire force out of Paris. It was a compelling narrative. A young British wizard had come to France, saved people, and emerged uninjured while slaying dozens of attackers. The day of the ceremony, the ministry's great hall was packed. A recent international council on the werewolf and vampire problem had left the ministry unusually crowded. In places, there was scarcely room to stand. In the center of the hall, a long table draped in red silk held the medal, glinting under the chandeliers. Ferris Spavin stood before it, dressed in exceptional formality, showing how seriously he regarded the event. He needed something to draw French wizards' attention away from the horror of that night, and Arthur's story served that purpose. Ferris read from a prepared parchment, outlined Arthur's deeds, offered the usual pleasantries, and finally walked forward to pin the medal on him. Applause filled the hall. Congratulations came from every direction, even from many who doubted that a 12-year-old could have achieved what the reports claimed. Arthur's name spread overnight. The Daily Prophet in Britain ran the story as well. Who could resist a handsome, powerful, endlessly wealthy young wizard? After the ceremony, Arthur experienced life as a celebrity. Crowds swarmed him, reporters pressed for interviews, and the sudden spotlight frightened him so much he hid in the recently repaired Delacour family home and refused to go out. When he returned to Britain, reporters still waited outside the Delacour's residence, hungry to determine whether this young prodigy lived up to the praise. Britain already had its own celebrated savior, who had defeated a Dark Lord in his infancy. Another miraculous figure felt almost too fantastical, even in a world of magic. Arthur would have refused the medal if he could, but now that he had accepted it, travel to France would be easier. He would no longer need to pass through the ministry for every legal crossing. The medal might also be useful if his uncle were ever caught smuggling. An honor could smooth things over. The Paris attack had rocked the wizarding world and shaken Arthur as well. He was beginning to see that in this world, wizards were not the only force of power. Other magical beings held significant sway. Even when vampires and werewolves offended wizardkind, the likely outcome would be negotiated punishment rather than wholesale annihilation, because any large-scale conflict risked exposing magic to muggles. The conservative faction, the defenders of the International Statute of Secrecy, would oppose anything that risked discovery. More than half of the high-ranking officials in the Wisengamot supported the statute, and even Albus Dumbledore, then recognized as the most powerful wizard, supported it. Until that generation of officials left the world, the wizarding world would likely remain cautious and secretive unless another Grindelwald rose to change the balance. With limited freedom of travel, Apparition was still not commonly mastered by Arthur's generation. Going far in the summer carried risks. To protect the Delacour sisters, Fleur and Gabrielle, Arthur used the remainder of his vacation to craft magical defense necklaces, improvements on the designs recorded in the alchemical texts Nicolas Flamel had given him. They were only semi-finished, useless against a powerful wizard, but capable of defending against a werewolf or vampire or two. He braided each necklace with the sisters' own hair so they could sense the item's state more intuitively. During the work, Arthur discovered why Vila hair was prized for wand cores. When woven with Fleur's hair, the necklace carried a faint spiritual edge, intuitively responsive in the same way unicorn hair repels the dark arts. The Vila hair made the charm's use more natural for Fleur and reduced its magical consumption. The discovery raised new questions for him. Vila, unicorns, phoenixes, many magical creatures furnished materials for powerful magical tools. Wizards themselves, however, had the highest ceiling. The most powerful forces in this world were wielded by wizards. Could a powerful wizard use his own hair, or even part of his body, as material for alchemical work? Arthur dismissed any idea of bodily modification. That level of alchemy was beyond his world, and he had no intention of losing limbs. But he did plan to experiment with his own hair. With nearly a month left of summer holidays, he had just enough time to try. Before he could begin, a major event forced him back to Britain. July 31st was Harry Potter's birthday, and also Arthur's. Arthur didn't mind sharing the date. He had always spent summers in France after his mother's death, so his birthdays were usually celebrated at the Delacour house or with his uncle Antoine. This year the Delacours hosted again, and Antoine made one of his rare appearances. Antoine worked in the gray areas of the magical world while Mr. Delacour was an auror. They knew each other's true roles and sometimes cooperated, but face-to-face meetings were still a little awkward. After an afternoon together, Antoine slipped away. Of everyone present, the most excited person was not Arthur but Gabrielle, for the birthday cake. Antoine had brought it, piled generously with every fruit and chocolate Gabrielle loved. Mr. Delacour, however, frowned at the cake. Ever since Arthur had taken Fleur's hand last time, and Fleur had told him he didn't understand Arthur, Mr. Delacour found the whole thing a little irritating. The cake alone was at least half a month's auror salary. What a waste, he thought sourly, and then proceeded to eat heartily, as if to swallow the affront. Gifts followed. Gabrielle gave Arthur a potted plant she had raised, a small, lovely blue flower useful as an ingredient in healing potions. Fleur presented a silver-white bracelet woven from her own hair. Mr. Delacour glanced at his wife. He had never received anything like that. Then Arthur produced the item he had made, a magical defensive necklace, entirely silver, cord and gems alike. A larger gem hung at the front. A smaller spherical gem was threaded toward the back. Arthur had asked Baru to procure the gems. Baru had been struck by a spell during the last incident and found unconscious in a patch of grass, recovered later by an auror. Ashamed for failing to protect Arthur, Baru had nearly mutilated his own hand. Arthur knew the enemy that night had been beyond Baru anyway, but as a punishment, and as a precaution, he had tied a blood-stained length of unicorn tail hair, left by the house elf Charlotte, to Baru's hand. The scar would be permanent, but the hair would allow Charlotte to sense Baru's location should anything similar happen again. The gems themselves were superb, extremely hard. Arthur had reinforced them further, enclosing each in a thin gold band engraved with ancient runes. Fleur touched the necklace and her eyes filled with Arthur. Mr. Delacour, ever the skeptical auror, stepped forward. As someone familiar with defensive magic, he'd seen similar items. The Ministry's auror office had even bought a few defensive cloaks recently, with underwhelming results. "Is this real? What does it do exactly?" he asked. Arthur explained, "It's a defensive necklace. If you face malicious magic, the gem will detach and help block an attack. It's not invincible, it won't stand up to sustained assault from a very powerful wizard, but it can handle the likes of 1 or 2 vampires or an ordinary auror." "An auror?" Mr. Delacour's eyebrows rose. Aurors represented the Ministry's best combat wizards. To become one required passing strict exams. Even in a peaceful era, they were among the most capable. Arthur only smiled. "We'll see," he said. "All right, let me try it." Mr. Delacour raised his wand and, aiming at Fleur, shouted, Petrificus totalis! A white light shot toward her, but broke off 2 meters out against a silver gem glowing faintly gold. Clap, clap, clap! Gabrielle clapped enthusiastically, palms red. Amazing! Now I'm not afraid of those vampires anymore. The Delacours were pleased. For Aurors, the necklace wasn't essential, but Fleur and her sisters couldn't apparate yet. A defensive charm that activated automatically was a real boon. Mr. Delacour's regard for Arthur warmed accordingly, though he still had questions. What if the attack comes from behind? Arthur walked close to Fleur, turned her, and pointed to the small gem at the back. It detects attacks from behind too, but it takes a moment to get into position. Delacour cast another Petrificus totalis from behind. Again, the spell was intercepted, this time roughly 1.5 meters behind Fleur. The gem had to move around the neck to intercept, so there was a slight delay. Mr. Delacour's expression shifted from curiosity to genuine approval. Did you make this? He asked. I did. Can you make more? Arthur shook his head. The materials are rare. Even excluding the single most important ingredient, the rest would cost hundreds of galleons. I couldn't mass-produce them. The crucial material he knew only too well could only be obtained from the remnant of Lord Voldemort's soul, and he had only a little left, which he wanted to use for further experiments. Mr. Delacour looked disappointed but grateful that Arthur had made at least 2 for Fleur and her sister. Mrs. Delacour seemed to regard Arthur like a son-in-law, and Fleur would not let go of his hand. The next afternoon, after a pleasant birthday, Arthur received a letter from Creature. Inside was a copy of the Daily Prophet. The headline screamed, Sirius Black escapes Azkaban. Below the words, a moving image showed Sirius Black, roaring and clutching his nameplate, the paper calling him the first prisoner to successfully escape Azkaban, an extremely vicious murderer who had used an exploding curse on XX Street. With the last Black free from Azkaban, Arthur knew he had to return. Even if he chose not to, the Ministry would surely force a search of the House of Black. The ancestral home might no longer be his first priority, but it was still the face of the House of Black. As an heir, imperfect though he might be, he could not allow its basic dignity to be compromised. 107. Cornelius Fudge. The day after Sirius's escape from Azkaban, Arthur said goodbye to the Delacour family and his uncle and returned to Britain. Reporters who had been camping outside the Delacour's home could no longer laze about. Back in Britain, Arthur had Creature take him straight to the Black ancestral home. The new Black manor was still under renovation. Even with magic, a grand house couldn't be finished in just over a month. He had planned to stay in France all summer and move in after the next term, but Sirius's escape cut that plan short. Arthur had expected Sirius might get away, but he'd thought it would happen a few days before term, not an entire month ahead. As soon as the Ministry heard Arthur was back at the ancestral home, they sent people. No one really wanted to inspect the Black House. Arthur Black was their greatest patron, an influential man who might be the next Dumbledore. But the public outcry was too loud to ignore. Azkaban, the prison that had never had a successful escape, had its first fugitive, a notorious criminal accused of killing more than a dozen muggles with a blasting curse. Sirius was already listed among the world's most dangerous dark wizards. The inspection was led by the Minister for Magic himself, Cornelius Fudge. He even brought a reporter who snapped pictures before they'd crossed the threshold. At the gate, Fudge clasped Arthur's hand and spoke low. Mr. Black, I'm terribly sorry about this, but the public uproar has forced our hand. I have to look into everything. Arthur's smile was polite, though he disliked the show. It's all right, Minister Fudge. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I have never killed another wizard, and I would not shelter those who kill freely. Fudge's mouth twitched. As minister, he had access to certain facts. Not long ago, the young wizard before him had, in a short span, ruthlessly slain dozens of vampires while protecting 2 young witches. He had done so without suffering harm. That made it clear Arthur's power exceeded that of those vampires, and that when lawful opportunity allowed, Arthur would be merciless. Fudge suspected Arthur might not even consider vampires fully human. After a brief exchange of civility, Fudge led his subordinates on a rather perfunctory walk around the courtyard, not even opening any doors. Then he turned to Arthur. Mr. Black, I know your nature. You would never shelter such a criminal. When I get back, I'll put a statement in the Daily Prophet clarifying that the House of Black has nothing to do with this. Sirius was disowned long ago. Arthur smiled without answering. Politics were ugly. Creature had already told him that aurors had been watching the place from the day Sirius escaped. Fudge had waited until Arthur returned, playing the solicitous uncle. He wasn't Dumbledore's kindly openness. He was a man consumed by power. After today, Arthur thought, he would let Fudge see how treacherous people's hearts could be. Still, he said, with righteous air, there's no need. Since Sirius is connected to the House of Black, it's only proper the aurors search the house thoroughly. I can even show you the cellar. Fudge took his words as politeness and waved him off. That will do, Mr. Black. I trust you. If there's nothing else, I'll be going. Arthur made a half-hearted attempt to detain him twice, then let him go. As the minister departed, he nodded toward a black dog lying in the grass near the gate. There's a stray dog here, pure black, quite handsome. Arthur, a little surprised, replied, It is handsome. I'll be moving to the new manor soon. This old house would be perfect for keeping a dog to guard the place. Fudge agreed. A dog does deter some thieves. After Fudge left, Arthur had Creature call the dog inside and fed it bread and milk. Then he noticed a tiny beetle perched on the main gate, one of those small, curious insects. The beetle was the reporter Fudge had brought along. Rita Skeeter, an unregistered animagus who loved turning into a beetle to steal stories. Arthur's note about the inspection had given her an irresistible scoop. Minister for Magic in a secret deal with a noble pure-blood heir, endangering the public. A headline like that would sell out tomorrow's Prophet and could send Fudge reeling. Rita was still in the throes of imagining her triumph when an invisible hand seized her. Creature caught the beetle, covered it with a glass cloche, and set it on a chair opposite Arthur. Miss Rita Skeeter, you wouldn't want the ministry to find out you're an unregistered animagus, would you? Arthur's tone was almost playful, half amusement and half threat. The beetle didn't move. Arthur raised his hand and a thin jolt of magic skewered the cloche. The beetle shuddered, and moments later a middle-aged woman with strangely permed blonde hair stood exposed, lips stretched into what she thought a winning smile. She forced a nervous grin. Mr. Black, I was simply surprised when you exposed me. Say the word, and I'll do whatever you ask. Creature set a moving photograph on the table that showed Rita's transformation from woman to beetle. Seeing her own metamorphosis captured in a picture, Rita's forced cheer froze. She became obsequious and terrified. Over the years, she'd offended many at the ministry and among the old pure-blood families. If anyone truly learned of her illicit animagus status, she wouldn't last long. Arthur didn't make any grand demands. He instructed Creature to hand her a few photographs, proof of the conversation with Fudge, and told her to report truthfully that he had invited the inspection and had offered to show the house. The implication was clear. Portray the minister's visit honestly and keep her mouth shut about her animagus identity. Faced with the photographs and the photograph of her own betrayal, Rita had no choice but to comply. The next day, Cornelius Fudge made a solemn statement in the Daily Prophet. We are doing everything in our power to recapture Sirius Black, the minister declared. We visited the Black ancestral home yesterday, but found no trace of him. I urge the wizarding public to remain calm. I stake my life on the fact that Sirius will be apprehended. The article was illustrated with a photograph of Fudge leading officials as they inspected the Black House. That afternoon, a small tabloid published a very different version of events. Its photograph showed Arthur Black tugging at Fudge's sleeve, urging him to continue the search, while Fudge stubbornly turned away. Rita Skeeter's piece ran their conversation verbatim. The article even claimed the pair's lip movements matched the printed dialogue. Skeeter's account accused Fudge of ignoring Arthur's offer to allow aurors to inspect the house to prove his innocence. Portraying the minister as lazy and perfunctory, the story landed like a slap across the ministry's face. Fudge exploded in his office. "Who did this?" he shouted. "There's already that invisible man leaking ministry secrets, and now someone's attacking me personally. Find whoever did this. I want that person in Azkaban for the rest of his life." His secretary ventured a suggestion. "Minister, It may be the work of an illegal animagus. Only an animagus could get close to ministry affairs without being noticed. Of course it's an animagus, Fudge snapped, clenching his fists. This is the fault of those Hogwarts professors being careless. They must know if students are learning to become animagi, and yet they never reported it. Perhaps Dumbledore is behind this. He's after my job and has sent someone to undermine me. No one contradicted him. If Dumbledore had wanted the post, he could have taken it after Grindelwald or after Voldemort's fall years ago. He had declined. Fudge himself had only been minister with Dumbledore's blessing. Once secure, though, Fudge grew wary of anyone who could unseat him and became colder to his subordinates. They were not in a position to argue. An Auror in the room, trying for a different angle, asked, "Minister, could Sirius himself be an animagus? Is that how he escaped Azkaban?" Fudge scoffed. If he were an animagus, why didn't he escape sooner? Why stay in Azkaban with Dementors for 12 years and only escape now? Maybe. He learned it there? The Auror suggested hesitantly. Fudge's face twisted with contempt. Learn it in Azkaban, where he couldn't even see the moonlight. He turned to his secretary for another lead. What about that black stray dog people saw near the Black House? They questioned the Aurors stationed at the property. The answer disappointed them. The black dog kept to the yard, ate and slept as any stray would, and refused to let Arthur touch it, unsurprising behavior for a recently acquainted stray. The trail to the so-called invisible man ran cold, but the public, alarmed by the escaped convict Sirius, demanded answers fast. Cornelius Fudge had no way to repudiate the tabloid's report. Helplessly, he published that Aurors had been assigned to monitor the Black House, which temporarily calmed the protesters who had come to the ministry. Arthur acted as if he were hearing the whole controversy for the first time and immediately cut off a planned donation to the ministry. Desperate to regain the funds and mollify public outrage, Fudge acceded to many of Arthur's demands. He only briefly considered the possibility that Arthur might be the instigator. Arthur was young and, in Fudge's view, unlikely to orchestrate such a thing, and he hadn't even been born when the earlier invisible man had been active. The ministry's coffers were already strained by the recent hunt for Sirius. Arthur's conditions seemed far easier to accept than continued public fury. The ministry agreed to sell Arthur the tract of ministry land bordering his newly built Black Manor. The payment Arthur subsequently made was nominally for that purchase. The Aurors visibly stationed around the ancestral home would be withdrawn. Arthur would be appointed as an unspeakable in the Department of Mysteries. He also provided specific funds to establish a research team to study the veil in the Death Chamber, the veiled archway that is a one-way gateway to the world beyond death, the place related to Sirius's demise after being struck by Bellatrix's curses. After his last meeting with a Ravenclaw, Arthur had grown curious about the afterlife, the place wizards enter only after death. Securing the veil at the ministry was an opportunity to advance his understanding. The Department of Mysteries had become nearly dormant. Few unspeakables continued its research. Still, the department's rules remained. When an unspeakable selected an object to study, others could not claim it, unless after 10 years the original researcher had produced no results. In practice, that meant Arthur would effectively control the veil for a decade. The future might bring powerful events. The deaths of great wizards could shift power, and that control could be invaluable. For Arthur, the veil was a way to prepare for his own eventual passage. He wanted to learn what he could about the other side, so he might avoid mistakes when he too crossed it. Once the deals were in place, Arthur's displeasure with Fudge cooled. The Aurors withdrew, leaving only two quietly continuing to monitor the house in shifts. A few days before Hogwarts term began, Arthur finally managed to get hold of the aloof black dog. He grabbed it by the scruff and carried it up to his room. The black dog fought like mad while Arthur held it, legs scrabbling and body straining, but it couldn't break his grip. When the door shut, the animal was tossed to the floor and yelped, hunching into a corner and watching Arthur like any wary stray. Arthur didn't need to be fooled. He knew it wasn't a dog at all. It was Sirius Black. From Harry's point of view, Sirius could be the best elder anyone could ask for. From Arthur's, he was far more complicated. Disowned by the House of Black and forever at odds with much of his family, Sirius had likely been shaped by Black attitudes as much as he'd resisted them. He could be prejudiced and cold-blooded. When he got swept up in something, he would ignore other people's feelings and consequences. Yet he also had a side that didn't fit the rest of his family. Like his animagus form, when it came to those he loved, he could be fiercely loyal and warm. Once his name had been cleared, he could be affable and kind. Toward Harry, his best friend's son, and others in the Order of the Phoenix, he had been excellent. But Arthur couldn't forget the recklessness. After Sirius escaped Azkaban, his choices had often been irrational. The year before, the Chamber of Secrets had nearly closed Hogwarts. The school had been on a knife edge, and the only person calm enough to manage the parents' fury had been Dumbledore. In that context, the sensible thing for Sirius to have done after escaping would have been to find Dumbledore, explain himself, and let them capture Peter Pettigrew properly. Instead, he caused panic, frightened students, and even, as everyone remembered, managed to break Ron's leg. If a pupil had been seriously hurt and parents had protested, Hogwarts could easily have been forced to suspend classes. If Sirius wanted vengeance, there were many ways: working through the Ministry, arranging for Pettigrew's lawful imprisonment or execution, but he chose to take matters into his own hands. Time in Azkaban might explain some of it, but Arthur saw patterns that went back farther. At 15 or 16, when Sirius and James and Remus and Peter had cornered Snape in the Shrieking Shack, it was James's intervention that saved Snape from a terrible fate. If James had stood aside, Snape might have been bitten to death or left maimed and infected. Would a sane person give the key to a locked room containing a dangerous, out-of-control werewolf to someone they disliked? The incident left scars on everyone's reputations. Dumbledore later admitted that Sirius's conduct made it hard for people to accept his innocence and perhaps even suspect that he had betrayed his friends. That mixture of devotion and volatility made Arthur's feelings about Sirius contradictory. By blood, Sirius was now one of the closest relatives he had, and in theory someone he could count on. Yet Arthur suspected that deep down, Sirius's loyalty truly belonged to James Potter above all else, a devotion bordering on obsession. So despite family ties, Arthur had other people he trusted more. His other uncle, Antoine, seemed steadier and more reliable. In the end, Arthur decided it was better to confront Sirius directly. "All right," he said, bending down until they were eye to eye with the animal. "Stop pretending, Uncle Sirius. No matter how good a dog you act, you're not a proper stray. Where would a real stray be as clean as you? The fur under your belly wasn't dirty when I first saw you. You're not a border collie or a husky, and you're not some beast. Those clever eyes of yours have already told me you're not a dog." Sirius had wandered aimlessly after seeing Harry, and by some circuitous route found himself at the Black ancestral home. He remembered that his youngest brother had a child and had come to look, only to be discovered on his first glance. When Arthur showed he knew who he was and didn't intend to turn him in, Sirius shifted back into human form. He was a middle-aged man with hair gone a little wild, body thin and pale, his eyes set deep and sharp. He didn't look like a harmless visitor, but there was still something of the old charm left in him. He sank into a chair with a groan, as if grateful for the solid wood beneath him, and looked at Arthur. "If you know who I am," he said, "why didn't you tell the Ministry?" "Why would I hand you over?" Arthur answered evenly. Sirius's mouth twisted into a bitter humor. "Don't you know I'm a murderer? I betrayed my most trusted friend and killed 13 muggles." His tone was mocking, as if testing Arthur's reaction. Arthur smiled, cold. "There are too many contradictions in your story. Even your escape from Azkaban suggests things aren't as they were told." Sirius tilted his head, taking Arthur in with a little curiosity. "You're not like your father," he said. Arthur knew what Sirius meant. His father could be indecisive, some would even call him a coward. Still, he was Arthur's father. Which was worse, Arthur wondered, a man who shrank from danger or a man who rushed blindly into it, ignoring everyone else? He didn't answer. Instead, he moved to a drawer, took out a few things, and set them on the table. "These are for you," he said. "Take a look." Sirius picked them up. There was a small pouch of galleons, 100,000 as Arthur had counted it, the deed to a plot of land and a shop in Diagon Alley. Arthur looked Sirius in the eye as he continued. If you ever clear your name, the ancestral home can be yours. But I will remove certain things I need from within it, and I will not allow the house to be transferred or given to anyone outside the House of Black. Arthur spoke as the head of the House of Black, fulfilling what he considered his duty. He could not allow the ancestral home to be handed off to Harry Potter, no matter Sirius's wishes. Sirius's first instinct was to refuse. He could see Arthur's reservation. They had never met, no bond had been built between them. But he'd seen Harry. The boy was doing poorly, and despite his contempt for the house, Sirius cared for his godson. He felt the obligation to provide Harry a home fit for him. Slowly the tension eased from Sirius's shoulders. I'll remember this, he said finally, and I'll remember what you've done for him. 110. The start of a new semester and the arrival of the Dementors. After that incident, Arthur and Sirius both tacitly avoided discussing anything beyond the immediate. Arthur had drawn a clear line. He would keep his distance from whatever Sirius planned to do next. That afternoon, using the excuse that the black dog was unnatural and he couldn't touch it, Arthur had Creature dispose of the animal in front of the hidden aurors. The black dog, of course, was not Sirius, but the corpse of a stray Creature had found outside. Creature then sent Sirius away. As he pushed him off, Creature disgustedly wiped his hands that had just held Sirius, on his own clothes, then remembered the garments had been bought for him by his master. He scowled at Sirius and smacked himself a few times. Humph. It's all because you, who betrayed the House of Black, came back and made young master spend so much money. If I weren't afraid the ministry would notice a wizard apparating, I wouldn't have sent you off. Sirius, for his part, treated Creature with cool indifference. The house elf, brainwashed by his mother, had always been repellent to him. Now he seemed to have been re-brainwashed by the nephew he had just met. Seeing Creature dressed in finer clothes than his own, Sirius thought that wasn't a bad thing. His nephew must be a decent man, rational and kind, like James after he settled down with Lily. Thinking of James reminded him of Harry, and he left without answering Creature's tirade. Once Sirius was gone, Arthur set about preparing for the new Hogwarts term. This year, if nothing changed, Hogwarts would be ringed with Dementors. Arthur had been very curious about them. After his last inquiry at the Ministry, he had been allowed access to all the files on the Veil in the Department of Mysteries. One detail that fascinated him was that, when the Ministry had still functioned as the Wizengamot, an unspeakable named Extus, also the famed builder of Azkaban, had studied the Veil. Most records of Extus had been destroyed, but while reviewing summarized unspeakable archives, Arthur had found a letter that mentioned Extus and said he had made an important discovery. The date on the letter lined up with the 15th century, the time Azkaban first appeared. With that hint of connection, Arthur decided he wanted to capture a few Dementors for study. Even if he couldn't examine them immediately, he could keep some as future research subjects. After all, he was already raising several Foodabats, and Dementors, creatures that didn't need to eat, would be easier to keep if properly contained. The start of term came quickly. Arthur sat in the compartment, thinking about the Dementors and about Sirius, who would soon be at Hogwarts. He had always considered Sirius cold-blooded, but really he was just indifferent, like Lupin had been at school, not opposing anything, but not taking part either. Lupin's detachment had been because of his werewolf nature. Arthur's was a choice, perhaps fitting his new identity as a member of the Black family after his transmigration. Draco, watching Arthur gaze out the window, nudged him impatiently. "Arthur, we haven't seen each other in ages. Don't you have anything to tell me?" Arthur smiled and with mock solemnity answered, "Of course. Let me tell you what happened when I went to France." Good, good. Hurry up and tell me," Draco said eagerly. Draco had already read about Arthur in the Prophet and wanted the first-hand account. Lately, the most talked-about figures were in order: Sirius, then Arthur. Even the boy who lived in Dumbledore had to settle for third and fourth. The Prophet had reported Arthur's slaughter of dozens of vampires in France and his receiving an honorary medal from the French Ministry of Magic. Right after that came the story of Arthur's escaped uncle and Minister Fudge's ham-fisted attempts at a show of authority. If Arthur had been Lockhart, he could have written 3 new bestsellers with all this. Seeing Draco's eager face, Arthur grinned. This time in France, Fleur and I made our relationship official. It's just that I'm still young. Otherwise. Otherwise what? Draco began, and then, as the implication dawned on him, exploded. What the? You just started 3rd year. You abandoned me without a second thought. Arthur tried to soothe him. Don't worry. You have Pansy, don't you? It's all the same. Pansy's name made Draco bristle. What do you mean the same? Pansy isn't pretty. She's sharp-tongued and unreasonable. If it weren't for her decent grades, I'd suspect she and Goyle shared a troll's brain. Draco was visibly riled and had even stood up. Arthur was about to continue, but the carriage dimmed suddenly, and the air went sharply cold, a chill that had no place on a summer day. Wizards in the compartment shivered, and Draco wrapped his arms around himself, frowning. What's going on? It feels like winter just dropped in. Arthur drew his wand and held it ready. Draco, you should take yours out too. Some special visitors have arrived. Draco pulled his wand with a muttered, Special visitors? What are they? Then broke off when he saw the hovering gloom. Dementors, Arthur said. Draco almost dropped his wand. Shouldn't they be in Azkaban? How did they get here? Arthur felt the presence of Dementors approaching and ran his fingers along his wand. Probably the Ministry's worried and sent them to search for Sirius. Screams echoed from other compartments. Draco, angry and embarrassed for the Auror's ineptitude, muttered, Useless Aurors. Blowing money on them is a waste. I'll tell my father when we get back. He fell silent when a head of cold drifted into the compartment and a Dementor eased the door open, peering in. Arthur nudged Draco's stiff form and hissed, Go, Draco. Use the charm I taught you last time. That's their bane. Draco knew what Arthur meant, the Patronus. Arthur had practiced it with him before, using a restrained foodabat as a training aid. Back then, facing a physical threat that couldn't truly harm him, Draco had barely managed to force a flicker of a peacock Patronus. Now, confronted with a creature that attacked the soul, his mind faltered. Thoughts became fog. The instructions Arthur had just given him slid away as if they had never been spoken. He only managed to stand there, wand held rigidly and pointed in the Dementor's direction as the cold pressed closer. 111. The Dementors were driven away. Dementors were dark, humanoid magical creatures. They wore black cloaks and their bodies looked as if they had rotted in water, with scabbed exposed palms, like the first stages of human decomposition. Their faces were featureless, nothing but a small circular hole where a mouth should have been. That hole was their weapon. They fed on happiness, and wherever a Dementor was present, the light and warmth of the surroundings would slowly drain away, leaving cold and despair. In close contact, they could suck out a person's very soul, a fate known as the Dementor's kiss, a result as final as the killing curse. For Hogwarts students, at the Ministry's insistence, Dementors were not allowed to give the full kiss. At worst, they could take small tastes of a wizard's happiness. Draco found himself facing just that situation now. The Dementor hovering over him did not attempt a kiss. It formed a small vortex at its mouth, preparing to devour his joy. Prisoners in Azkaban had little left to feed on, but inside the train, the students looked like tempting, fragrant meals. Arthur nudged Draco again, impatience in his voice. Draco, where's your courage? Do you want to stand there forever? No, of course not. I want to be a hero, Draco said, voice trembling, and forced himself to raise his wand. Expecto Patronum. From the tip of his wand, a pure white peacock emerged. The moment it took shape, warmth flooded Draco's chest, and the cold and darkness the Dementor brought evaporated. The little vortex at the creature's mouth collapsed. Confronted with a Patronus, the Dementor wisely stopped its advance. After checking the carriage and finding no sign of Sirius, it withdrew. Draco's face lit up with an unaccustomed, radiant grin. He had never imagined the day would come when he could drive off a Dementor guarding Azkaban. Courage, like any skill, could be cultivated. He thought of Harry in the original story, and this success gave Draco a new sense of accomplishment. Brimming with pride, he turned to Arthur. Arthur, let's go save the other Slytherins. You're practically our king. If you act, you'll drive those Dementors away in no time. Arthur chuckled. If you say so, being a king is more a title for fun, isn't it? That's different. We were children before, but now we're third years. If you save them this time, I'll make sure they listen." Arthur had been thinking of the unpredictable vampires and werewolves across the continent and the value of having loyal followers. If those creatures ever came to Britain, he would prefer not to be outmatched in influence. Still, his plan remained the same. Let Draco handle the negotiations and provide the deterrent force. He didn't fully trust the loyalty of some Slytherins, but cultivating allies was worthwhile. They stepped out into the corridor. Dementors patrolled outside the entire Hogwarts Express. Now and then, one slipped into a carriage and young wizards screamed. Arthur raised his wand, topped with a unicorn horn, and cast the Patronus charm. He'd often used the Soul Guardian to call forth a unicorn before, but now he deliberately avoided revealing the full extent of the magic he could wield against Dementors. He summoned a less showy unicorn Patronus this time. Even a supposedly inconspicuous Patronus was striking. Unicorns were remarkable magical creatures, and among current wizards, only Dumbledore and Arthur produced Patronuses shaped like such creatures. Arthur's unicorn was unusual as well, sporting a pair of large wings. Draco gasped at the sight. It had been this very unicorn that had once lured him into learning the Patronus charm. In the narrow corridor, the unicorn moved with an almost liquid grace, seeming to swim down the aisle. Wherever its spectral presence passed, Dementors were driven out as if swept by a current. Draco sent his peacock Patronus again and hurried the other way, eager to feel the thrill of being a rescuer and the center of attention. Soon, most of the Dementors had been expelled from the train. They hung above it, hovering but unwilling to come closer. Arthur did not stop there. He steadied his wand, then handed the unicorn's control to Charlotte. Under her guidance, the unicorn shot out of the carriage and expanded into true scale above the train. Its hidden wings unfurled fully. The horse grew larger than the roof of the carriages, its hooves beating out a thunderous sound. It rose until it matched the Dementor's altitude and then charged, wings slashing like great blades. The impact tore into the Dementors. The spectral attack did not kill them, but it inflicted such intense, searing pain, like 1,000 small knives piercing their minds, that every one of them fled. They were not here to suffer. Assigned to the ministry and hoping only to feast on the students' happiness at Hogwarts, they recoiled from an agony that felt like death. This unicorn Patronus was unlike any they had encountered. It made them think they might actually die, and they fled without hesitation. Back in the carriages, the students who had been peeking out of the windows erupted into cheers. The sound made the fleeing Dementors glance back, but the soaring unicorn held them at bay. Among those Draco had helped were Ginny Weasley and Harry Potter. The thought thrilled him more than winning the Quidditch Cup. Harry had been on the verge of collapsing under a Dementor's power, and Draco had been the one to send it away. He had saved Harry's life. Draco could already imagine how he might bring this up in future encounters with Potter. The memory of being rescued like this would be hard for Harry to forget. The Hogwarts Express soon pulled into the station, and the students poured out to attend the opening feast. After another sorting ceremony for the new arrivals, Dumbledore rose to speak. His nearly 2-meter height and beard that seemed to brush the floor made him impossible to miss. All eyes turned toward him. "Before the new term begins," he said, "I have a few things to tell you, one of them very important. As you already know, several Dementors from Azkaban have been deployed to the school by the Ministry of Magic to carry out official duties. They searched the Hogwarts Express earlier. I know that was an unpleasant experience, and I ask for your understanding. This is to ensure the safety of the school." A shadow of displeasure crossed his face as he continued. He was clearly unhappy that some students had had their happiness taken by the Dementors. "The Dementors will patrol the grounds this term, so anyone thinking of visiting the Forbidden Forest should abandon the idea. No disguise, potion, or magical item can fool a Dementor. Even an invisibility cloak is useless. If you encounter one, shout for help and run. The professors and I will be around the castle and ready to assist." He paused, looking for a moment toward the Slytherin table, and a pleased expression crept back over his face. "I would like to make a special commendation for 2 students, Arthur Black and Draco Malfoy. They drove the Dementors away on the train earlier. For that, I will award each of them 50 points. Slytherin erupted into cheers. Even the first years newly sorted into Slytherin swelled with pride. The other houses began to clap as well. Arthur and Draco had saved them, after all. To most students outside Slytherin, the two already seemed more approachable than the house's reputation suggested. Normally, Draco's nastiness was aimed only at Potter. Only Harry and Ron sat awkwardly, exchanging glances. Seeing the applause from the other houses, they joined in politely. Ron, especially, wished Draco hadn't saved him. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had all been helped by Draco's Patronus when Dementors had threatened on the train. If Harry had fainted, who knew what would have happened? Ginny had encountered a Dementor near their compartment too, and had also been driven away by Draco's Patronus. Ron glared at the new professor at the staff table. One of the new Defense Against the Dark Arts staff had been asleep on the train and had only woken to offer Harry a bit of chocolate after Draco had done all the work. In Ron and Harry's eyes, the new professor seemed so far unremarkable. Once the applause died down, Dumbledore smiled and continued. Now, a few words about the new staff joining us this year. We have 3 new professors. First, Professor Lupin, who I believe will be a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher you will all appreciate. When Lupin stood to acknowledge the clapping, it was polite but muted. His clothes were a little worn, and he didn't look wealthy. The students understood. Defense Against the Dark Arts is a position that changes hands often, and there aren't many wizards across Britain qualified to teach it. Our second new professor is Rubeus Hagrid, who will take over care of magical creatures, Dumbledore went on. Hagrid received a warm, familiar cheer. For the third position, Dumbledore said, some of you may know that Professor Bernhard made a very serious mistake, so I have invited an old friend to take on History of Magic, Professor Albert Winston. Albert Winston rose, very old, white-haired and bearded, but still robust, with the look of someone who kept himself fit. With the announcements complete, the opening feast began in earnest. The great hall filled with conversation and the delighted clatter of knives and forks as students tucked into the plentiful food prepared by the house elves. For many, the school's fare beat what they were served at home. After the feast, Draco strode over to the Gryffindor table alone. He didn't expect anyone to attack him after he had just saved them. He leaned toward Harry, extended his hand, and said loudly, "Hey, Potter, are you all right?" Harry gave a faint, awkward smile. "I'm fine. Thank you for earlier." His voice was so soft, Draco could barely hear it. Draco's smile only widened. Ron, however, was thoroughly displeased. "Humph, Malfoy," he sneered. "We don't need your fake concern." Draco's expression went a touch serious. "Weasley, I saved 2 Weasleys today. One of them your sister. Is that how you treat your savior? I thought maybe we could be friends. Since you won't accept that, I'll take my leave." He turned and walked away, then glanced back at Ginny with a lazy, mocking charm. "Miss Weasley, your brother looks rather cross with me. I did help you drive off the Dementor. Would you like to be my friend?" Ron sprang up to block Ginny and barked, "Malfoy, stay away from my sister." Draco smoothed his blonde hair, gave a sly, showy smile, and sauntered off as if he'd merely enjoyed the attention. Ron spat some crude words and then, bizarrely, threw out, "There's an old Chinese saying, a dog doesn't change its habit of eating filth." Hermione stared at him in surprise. "You know Chinese?" "Not really," Ron grumbled. "I heard it from a tourist while I was in Egypt." He turned to Ginny and warned, "Don't talk to Malfoy. His father used to be a dark wizard." Ginny folded her arms and puffed her cheeks. "All right, I know. I'm going back now. My roommates will be waiting." Harry and Hermione thought Ron was overreacting, but Malfoy was undeniably unpleasant, so they didn't argue. If Draco caused trouble again and didn't get his way, they decided they'd let it slide a few times, just enough to keep the peace. Arthur had been watching from a distance as Draco stirred up trouble. When he saw Draco teasing Ginny, an odd thought crossed his mind. What if the Weasley daughter's husband turned out to be Draco Malfoy? The Ginny Arthur saw here was nothing like the plain girl from the movie. She was clearly the school beauty. Her delicate features and thick, flame-red hair made her look elfin. Given what he knew of Draco, the idea wasn't impossible. If that arrogant boy teased her long enough, it might turn into one of those bratty becomes tender romances, a domineering CEO kind of story. Ginny was a pureblood too, so on paper, they weren't an impossible match. Ginny could fall for him. As a child, she had idolized Harry Potter, the savior, and in the original timeline had developed a crush on him in her second year. But Arthur had intervened earlier, and the Chamber of Secrets incident had never happened. There was no gallant Harry to rescue her. Today, in the dark, chilling moment with the Dementors, it had been Draco who stepped forward. His peacockish display had cut through the gloom and given her warmth and light. Under those circumstances, Arthur thought it was conceivable. Back at the dormitory, Draco brushed off his earlier exchange with Ginny. His goal, as Ron had already guessed, was simply to aggravate people. When they sat in the common room, he mimicked Ron and the others in vivid faces and then laughed uproariously. Under Arthur's influence, he had made Draco much less malicious than in the original story. The boy was more like a younger James Potter, cocky and showy but unlikely to cause serious harm. He just wanted attention. After the mockery, Draco pulled out his schedule and asked, "Arthur, what electives did you pick?" "Care of magical creatures and divination," Arthur answered. "That's perfect. Same as me," Draco said, delighted. "My dad recommended them." Hogwarts changed things in the third year. Instead of the rigid first and second year curriculum, students chose electives. There were 5 options: care of magical creatures, divination, arithmancy, ancient runes, and Muggle studies. Students had to pick at least 2 and at most 3, though a few, like Hermione, tried to take all of them, which required a time turner and a lot of administrative approval. Time turners were powerful but dangerous. History couldn't truly be rewritten, and safe trips were limited to very short spans, about 5 hours, if you wanted to avoid catastrophic side effects. Many wizards had died researching time turners, a fact Arthur had learned during his time in the Department of Mysteries. The more magically powerful the user, the greater the impact on time and the shorter the safe duration. That was one reason figures like Dumbledore avoided using them. Arthur's own magic stat on the panel had already reached a frightening 2048, nearly double that of an average Auror, so time turners were not a risk he wanted to take now. Besides, taking every course would only have worn him out. There would be opportunities to obtain a time turner later without needing to jam his schedule. So Arthur limited himself to care of magical creatures and divination. Of the 5 electives, he judged those 2 to be the only ones that would actually teach something useful. Arithmancy was little more than probability calculations, applying rigid rules and math to divination, and in the wizarding world it felt as pointless as a wand-wielding wizard using a lighter. Ancient runes meant nothing to him. Between the House of Black Library and books gifted by Nicholas Flamel, the great alchemist, Arthur had learned more than that professor could teach. Muggle studies was the most superfluous of all. Its teacher often wrote about Muggles from a purely wizarding perspective without real investigation. The next morning, Arthur's first class was divination. Sybil Trelawney had been in the classroom early, waiting for the third years who would be taking her subject for the first time. As the great-granddaughter of the legendary prophet Cassandra Trelawney, Sybil did possess some genuine ability. Arthur had enrolled partly out of curiosity. He wanted to see if she would ever lapse into a true prophecy, perhaps even one that concerned him. Her classroom could not have looked more different from the others. Small round tables replaced straight rows of desks, and each tabletop was scattered with divining tools, teacups, a crystal ball, tarot cards, playing cards. The walls were hung with strange symbols and portraits, and colored sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting the room with an otherworldly hue. The whole arrangement had the atmosphere of a fortune-teller's den. Arthur and Draco sat together, while Draco's larger friends were herded to another table. When all the students were seated, Sybil emerged from a shadowed corner. Her large glasses magnified her eyes, and she addressed them in a tremulous, theatrical voice. "Welcome to divination. I am Sybil Trelawney." She launched into her usual display, uttering portentous nonsense about who among them would face some calamity in a month, who might fall ill, and so on. Her predictions set a few students to whispering and made the rest listen with nervous eyes, each hoping not to be singled out. The room briefly filled with a palpable, anxious tension. This was Trelawney's favorite bit at the start of term, terrifying impressionable students with disasters and misfortunes. She seemed to relish the role. Perhaps it let her feel, if only for a moment, the grandeur of a prophet from her ancestry. Satisfied that she had unnerved them, she announced the day's lesson. "Now," she said, "pair up. Brew your own tea. Drink it until only the leaves remain. Then pass the cup to your partner. Using the patterns in your textbook, Unfogging the Future, divine what the leaves show." Most of the students, still rattled by her performance, accepted this charade as serious. Draco drank his tea with exaggerated enthusiasm. Arthur did the same. He wanted to see whether Trelawney would suddenly utter something astonishing if she came near him. Given the influence he held in this world, he thought, the odds of that happening might be higher. 114, Trelawney's new prophecy. Within minutes, all the little wizards' tables were laid out with cups of steeped tea leaves. They swapped cups, opened their copies of Unfogging the Future, and tried to read the shapes. Draco held Arthur's teacup and, consulting the book, said, let me see. The leaves look like a big tree? No, like a tree made of snakes." He turned to Arthur, slightly breathless with excitement. "Does this mean you'll be a Slytherin prefect someday? Or even head of house? This divination class is amazing. It's telling us how powerful you are. Arthur, look at mine. What do you see?" Arthur was speechless at Draco's flights of fancy, but he dutifully described the pattern in Draco's teacup from the book. "It looks like a peacock." Once Arthur decided on peacock, he couldn't imagine it as anything else. Draco, whose patronus was also a peacock, took the interpretation as gospel. "The more I look, the more it's a peacock," he said, flipping through Unfogging the Future. "It says you'll be very gifted and have a beautiful love life." Convinced the future was bright, Draco bounded over to Harry and the others and pretended to examine the teacup in Ron's hand. Ron was leaning over his cup when a golden head appeared behind him. "What are you doing, Malfoy?" "Just checking on you lot. Is this Potter's cup?" Ron answered without thinking, "Yes." Draco pointed to a clump of wet leaves and said with complete certainty, "Doesn't that look like a Dementor? It's crouching on a figure." Ron's stomach lurched. Trelawney had just made an on-the-spot prediction. She'd told Neville not to break his cup a moment before it had clattered to the floor. He ignored his dislike for Malfoy and peered into the cup. The dark clump of leaves really did resemble the hooded cloak of a Dementor. Once suggested, his mind filled with the image and he could see nothing else. Harry, who had just suffered a real Dementor attack, leaned over too. After all, the cup was his. If there really were Dementors showing up in the tea, wouldn't that mean more attacks might happen in the school? Their little commotion drew Trelawney across the room. She picked up Harry's cup and suddenly, her eyes widened. Her voice trembled, as if startled by her own sight. "Oh no, that's not a Dementor. It's a black dog, an ill-omened black dog." Harry's breath stopped. First a Dementor, now the black dog. The memory of the strange black dog that had looked at him with odd eyes flashed through him. Could both things be true? Would he really face ominous things soon? Hermione frowned at how tense Harry had gone and, sounding exasperated, said, "These are just guesses. Everyone sees something different. If this actually worked, they'd use divination every morning and nobody would ever die." Trelawney bristled at Hermione's dismissal, but had no retort. Most wizards use divination for trivial matters like the weather. Only true seers could glimpse life and death futures, and she was not one of them most of the time. "Time will prove everything," she said, her voice suddenly solemn. "That will be all for today. Prepare for your next class." She turned back toward the lectern, but as she passed Arthur's table, she glanced at the cup there. For an instant, she froze. Her eyes went empty, and in a distant voice, she intoned, "When the claw is revealed, blood will flow, dark forces will reappear, the world will be plunged into chaos and ruin. Only the most dazzling light born of darkness can shatter that darkness and bring forth new life." Then Trelawney collapsed. Arthur steadied her quickly, easing her into the chair beside him. He knew she could speak true visions at odd moments, and this had all the hallmarks of a genuine prophecy. The words had weight. Something in the future would align with them. The other students were shaken. Trelawney's trance and collapse looked like the cost of a true vision. an unpredictable blow the occasional seer suffered. Several girls helped carry her to the hospital wing, while the rest of the class gathered their belongings and filed out in unnerved silence. On the way, Draco kept repeating the prophecy aloud, eager and puzzled. The most dazzling light born of darkness. Doesn't that sound like you, Arthur? Your lightning magic is pretty dazzling. Maybe, Arthur replied, offering no real denial. He couldn't ignore that the words had been spoken over his cup. What troubled him most was the claw. His first thought leaped to the werewolf he had encountered that summer. There was a werewolf in Hogwarts now. Could the claw mean that? Or was it a metaphor for a terrible weapon the reappearing darkness would use to spill blood? Who was the darkness? Could it mean Lord Voldemort? Without a time, a name, or more detail, Trelawney's prophecy both nagged and offered little comfort. Knowing it and not knowing it felt the same. Perhaps its purpose was to harden the resolve of those who would one day stand against the darkness, or perhaps to harden his own. Up in his office, Dumbledore had also heard the new prophecy. The words made him think of the other prophecy Trelawney had given before, the one about a savior. The reappearing darkness? Is it Tom? He wondered. Harry and Arthur? Who exactly is the savior? Or has Trelawney's sight shifted again? She is not, after all, a true seer most of the time. 115. Shift in focus. The last divination lesson with Professor Trelawney had been the only class Arthur ever showed genuine interest in. Hagrid's care of magical creatures, Lupin's defense against the dark arts, and the new History of Magic course, taught by Professor Albert Winston, left him cold. Sometimes Hagrid's hybrid beasts disgusted him so much he regretted choosing the subject. Still, none of those classes interfered with what Arthur really cared about: alchemy and his own magical studies. In alchemy, he had reached a point where theory was mostly settled. What remained was steady practice, trial and error. He'd been driven to alchemy by the strange residue left after Lord Voldemort's soul was destroyed, a substance with unusual properties. Arthur planned to use it to craft defensive devices that would compensate for a wizard's inherent vulnerability when caught unprepared. With the magical defense necklace largely complete, alchemical work had become a daily ritual, an hour or two each day making and testing items. The deeper he went into alchemy, the clearer one limit became. Without certain rare raw materials, alchemy could only go so far. Only the Philosopher's Stone offered the possibility of an instant leap to greatness, and he had no idea how one was forged. Perhaps the last stone's materials had already been consumed by Nicholas Flamel. Short of that, an alchemist could at best attain the influence of a Hogwarts dean. Reaching Dumbledore's level seemed impossible. So after finishing a set of anti-ambush alchemical devices, Arthur shifted his focus to lightning magic. Although he'd been practicing yin lightning, his proficiency lagged far behind his yang lightning. Synthesizing heavenly lightning in the future would demand a high level of yin mastery. In the game he'd played in his past life, heavenly lightning became available at level 60. Translating that to this world suggested it would appear when his total magic power hit around 6,000. He currently had 2048, so there was time. This was the real world, not a game where a single quest unlocked a new skill. Progress would come from applying the performance data from the game as a template while deepening his understanding of actual magic. Combining soul magic with his experience of yang lightning had accelerated his yin progress. He'd also been observing his lightning magic directly through his soul, trying to understand its nature more intimately. The essential principle here matched the world's: a wizard's soul power channeled into magic. Under soul magic's influence, and with his yang background, his yin lightning advanced quickly. The lightning shield he developed, paired with the magical defense necklace, promised to be highly effective against sustained attacks. While Arthur trained in the Room of Requirement, Sirius Black, the fugitive on the run, wasn't idle either. He had been hiding in the Forbidden Forest in the form of a black dog to avoid Dementors, gathering intelligence on Ron and Harry at Hogwarts. He even slipped into the Gryffindor dormitory, intending to kill Peter Pettigrew, but failed. That attempt alerted other wizards and confirmed Sirius's proximity to the school. The Ministry of Magic responded by proposing to station Dementors inside Hogwarts, one in each house common room. Dumbledore refused the idea, but the Ministry still increased the number of Dementors around the school. Some restless Dementors patrolled the Forbidden Forest, and occasional foragers were the students who strayed there for food. Under these pressures, Arthur and Draco unexpectedly became favorites among the younger students. They were the only pupils who knew the Patronus charm. Draco, ever fond of the spotlight, consulted Arthur and then founded a club to teach the Patronus charm. It wasn't dark arts. In the current climate, it could save lives, so the professors didn't object and even provided an empty classroom. The club began with Slytherins, then drew students from other houses. Membership eventually outgrew the dueling club and became the largest club at Hogwarts. Many Gryffindors joined too. Draco made a point of not provoking anyone beyond Harry's small circle. For students, learning the Patronus charm offered both protection from Dementors and a valuable skill for future employment. Parents praised Draco as a surprisingly generous teacher. For a while, the younger years across the four houses grew somewhat more harmonious, though the older Slytherins and Gryffindors still harbored old resentments. Draco savored the admiring looks from his peers. He loved standing on a podium and receiving praise. He enjoyed it so much he skipped Quidditch practice, and Slytherin's performance suffered. They scraped by in the first match, narrowly beating Ravenclaw, but lost heavily to Gryffindor the following week. Draco and the team sat in the stands, dejected, watching Gryffindor play Hufflepuff. Since they had already conceded a loss to Gryffindor, they needed Gryffindor to win today, so that if Slytherin could beat Hufflepuff later, they'd still have a shot at the cup. The match had everyone on edge. Every goal sent the stadium into a frenzy. Arthur wasn't at the stadium. He wasn't in the room of requirement either. He crouched hidden at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. He knew Dementors, unable to hold back their hunger, would be tempted to attack the students on the field. That made it an ideal opportunity to capture a few for his experiments. If the Ministry later noticed missing Dementors, they would likely assume they had escaped. Even if they suspected foul play, it would reflect badly on the Ministry's decision to allow so many Dementors near children, an embarrassment Fudge would avoid pursuing to the bitter end. If anything, the Ministry might send more Dementors, terrified that Sirius could strike the school again. Dementors made excellent subjects for Arthur's purposes. They didn't need feeding, they didn't die in the normal way, and their reproductive methods were obscure. They were, in his words, top-grade lab rats. He could repeatedly subject them to electrical shocks without truly killing them, which suited his experimentation. The more Dementors he could capture, the better his tests would be. Losses were acceptable for the sake of data. 116. Capturing Dementors. Arthur waited, perched on a broad branch in the Forbidden Forest, while a constant roar of cheers rose from the Quidditch pitch below. Even though he had little interest in Quidditch, the sound told him the match was at a fever pitch, and that the happiness that fed Dementors was at an all-time high. The pitch had become their hunting ground, and the students' joy a scent they could not ignore. Hunger made the Dementors lose whatever discipline they had. Even the Ministry personnel nearby could no longer control them. There were more Dementors converging on the pitch than the guards could manage, and more kept coming. Within minutes, nearly 150 Dementors sent by the Ministry had gathered over the stadium. The sky darkened as if night had fallen in an instant. Cold washed through the air, sucking the warmth from everything. The students looked up, terror on their faces. They knew what the darkness meant. Harry, the Seeker, was the closest to the horde. Chasing the golden snitch, he had flown high and at first blamed the chill on altitude. Then he saw the Dementors. It was almost immediate. An icy numbness filled his body. His mind went blank. He recognized only what was there in front of him, Dementors, and he blacked out, tumbling from the sky. The sight of Harry falling from nearly 200 meters sent a collective gasp through the stands. The Dementors hovered above, as if preparing to descend for their feast. Draco glanced up. For a split second, something like reluctance shadowed him. Seeing Harry fall was unsettling, but self-preservation won out. He drew his wand and conjured a peacock Patronus. A handful of other students, those who had learned the first stage of the Patronus charm in the club, produced small balls of white light from their wands. The peacock and the wavering light balls gave the Dementors pause. They were not full Patronuses, but they injected enough positive energy to make some of the creatures hesitate. Dumbledore, who had been watching the match with growing concern, rose from his seat when Harry went down. He had feared that the cheering might attract Dementors. He had not expected so many. There was no time to take out his wand. He pointed with his right hand and cried, "Arresto momentum!" Magic poured from his fingertip. It struck the falling Harry and slowed him dramatically. More than 10 meters above the ground, Harry's descent became gentle, and he landed unharmed. Dumbledore looked at Draco and the others with a brief, approving nod, then drew his wand and fired strand after strand of silvery white light at the hovering Dementors, driving them back. They recognized that the flashes were not full Patronuses, only the first stage lights, but it was enough to make them recoil. Scattered, the Dementors drifted across the grounds, and Ministry personnel worked furiously to herd them back to their posts. When the chaos settled, however, it became clear that many Dementors were missing. They had been drawn elsewhere. Arthur had been ready. He had not hidden himself this time. Standing on a huge tree trunk in the forbidden forest, he let enough of himself show to lure the hungry creatures. Dozens of Dementors, unable to find the students' joy at the pitch, diverted toward him instead. If they can't feed on the students, there's a lone wizard in the forest, their instinct seemed to say. More began to arrive, and Arthur counted over 30 coming his way. He dropped from the branch and ran toward a giant tree with a cavernous hollow, a space that could have once housed a troll, larger than a classroom. He slipped inside the hollow while the Dementors flew in, eager and careless. Then he acted. Arthur raised his wand. He summoned two things, a winged unicorn Patronus that passed through the trunk and took position outside the hollow, and, by a different spell, the Soul Guardian magic, a nearly 4-meter-tall, giant-like guardian inside it. At the same time, he cast a Patronus-like blue-white barrier through the tree itself, sealing the hollow's walls so the Dementors could not slip back out through the trunk. Their only exit was the hollow's single mouth, now watched over by the unicorn Patronus. One after another, the Dementors drifted into the entrance, then froze as they saw the scene within. The giant reached out and grabbed them. Unlike ordinary Patronuses, which at best caused pain without touching, this apparition could seize and squeeze. The Dementors felt themselves genuinely constrained. Before they could fully react, the giant held each creature and hurled it into a large leather trunk Arthur had brought, the same trunk he had once used for foodabats. The Dementors that arrived later suffered the same fate, thrown into the box without mercy. A few tried to back away at the entrance, but the unicorn Patronus drove them in, herding them like sheep. When the last of the Dementors were captured, Arthur counted 37 in total. They lay quietly inside the trunk, as though subdued by the containment. With the forest still cloaked in the aftermath of the assault on the pitch, Arthur took advantage of the confusion, carried the trunk back to the castle, and slipped it into the room of requirement. He stayed there, waiting until Draco came looking to boast about his bravery on the pitch, smug and unknowing of the true catch Arthur had just hidden away. 117. Draco is full of energy and the completion of Black Manor. Arthur, you should have seen me on the Quidditch pitch just now. Everyone watched me use a Patronus charm to drive those Dementors off. That gave Professor Dumbledore the chance to repel them with his wand. Draco talked for nearly 5 minutes, clearly thrilled. Then, as if remembering something, he added, "Oh, I almost forgot, Arthur. Come with me now. Because of the Dementors today, everyone has to sleep in the Great Hall. The professors think there might still be Dementors hiding in the castle, so they're searching tonight." By the time the two of them reached the Great Hall, almost all the students were gathered there, except for Harry, who was in the hospital wing. Dumbledore stood when he saw the crowd and spoke in a firm voice. "Hogwarts is not safe at the moment. I must ask you to remain here for the night, while the professors search the castle for any remaining Dementors." He then looked toward Arthur. He knew Arthur often used the room of requirement. As a student, he had once felt similarly confident in his own ideas, to the point where lessons no longer taught him anything new. Dumbledore trusted that Arthur could take care of himself and did not interfere. Turning to Draco, who stood beside Arthur, Dumbledore announced, "There is one student I wish to commend. When we were attacked by those Dementors, he showed remarkable bravery. True courage is shown in the face of danger. Mr. Draco Malfoy exemplified that perfectly. I award him 50 points." Applause broke out across the hall. The students who had joined Draco's Patronus attempt were especially enthusiastic. Becoming a hero was a dream shared by Draco, Ron, and many others. Gryffindors, in particular, fancied themselves finding the sword of Gryffindor and slaying Dementors with a single stroke, basking in the admiration of their peers. Draco stood proud and beaming, drinking in the praise. He had already received 50 points at the start of term, now another 50. Add Arthur's 50 from the start of term, and Slytherin was suddenly looking very strong in the House Cup race. The award was indisputably deserved too. No one could dispute it. After awarding the points, Dumbledore arranged for Snape to guard the Great Hall and sent Professor McGonagall to lead a search of the castle. He himself went to the Ministry of Magic. The ministry had to be given an explanation for what had happened. Hogwarts was, after all, more than just a school. If Hogwarts were lost, the British wizarding world would be devastated. Cornelius Fudge, the minister, found himself balancing political survival against the safety of the students. He could not remain at Hogwarts forever. The Dementors must be kept away from the students, but Fudge initially viewed Dumbledore's actions with suspicion. Worrying Dumbledore intended to use the incident against him. It was only after parental pressure the next day that Fudge accepted Dumbledore's plan. The ministry would place Dementors around Hogwarts to form a perimeter, but they were not to approach or be allowed to sense what was happening inside the castle buildings. If any Dementor crossed that boundary, ministry duty officers were to drive them back. To create a perimeter strong enough to catch a fugitive like Sirius Black would require more Dementors, and if Sirius broke into the castle, the Dementors' response would be slower. Against Dumbledore's advice, and partly to assert his own control, Fudge requested a reinforcement point near the Hogsmeade station platform. A wizard capable of casting the Patronus charm, plus 2 Dementors, would be stationed there to help capture Sirius at a moment's notice. Dumbledore ultimately agreed. The arrangement turned out to be a relief for many. The professors could search with more assurance, the students could return to a freer routine, and Dumbledore could attend to other urgent matters, including international meetings and the long, difficult task of searching for Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes. Arthur, in particular, stood to benefit. The number of guinea pigs he could work with had suddenly increased. And Sirius Black, the fugitive himself, was quietly pleased by the change. Sirius was hiding near Hagrid's hut. Dementors used to pass on patrol nearby. With the new rule barring Dementors from approaching Hogwarts buildings, Hagrid's hut was naturally included. For the first time in a long while, he could sleep without dread of the cold seeping into him and stealing the rest he had painfully gathered. He had also heard about the Dementors attacking Harry on the Quidditch pitch, which had worried him greatly. The news had been brought to him by Crookshanks. Because Sirius could transform into a dog, he got on well with Crookshanks, who was part Kneazle, and the cat passed along many scraps of information. Crookshanks had even reported that Hermione had been fretting about the Dementors and, in her haste to check on Harry, had once forgotten to give Crookshanks his treat. At Christmas, Sirius had bought and sent Harry a firebolt, the latest, fastest broomstick, out of concern. He also reflected on his nephew Arthur, whom he'd only met once and who had just shown remarkable generosity. Arthur had given him 100,000 galleons. Without that gift, Sirius's savings from his time on the run wouldn't have bought half a firebolt. Arthur was also celebrating Christmas away from school for the first time this year because Black Manor was finally complete. Kreacher had moved most of the manor's contents to the new Black Manor. Walburga Black's portrait, Sirius's mother's, had been hung in the main hall by Arthur. A wizard's portrait, after all, is animate in its own way and could watch over the place while Sirius returned to the manor, warding off thieves and the like. Whether Sirius would later lock the portrait away was no longer Arthur's concern. 118. Are Dementors visitors from the world of death? The new Black Manor was grand in a way that gave it a Hogwarts-like air: mountains, water, and carefully arranged grounds, although the buildings themselves were on a smaller scale. Arthur had also built a ranch on the mountain beside the manor, using the land the Ministry of Magic had compensated him with. The Black family had once owned several of the nearby peaks. After the deal with the Ministry, every mountain visible from the estate belonged to him. This time Arthur returned not only for himself, but with new captives, 78 Dementors. About half he had seized during the Dementor riot. The rest were taken in the intervening weeks. The number was relatively small because his experiments had been costly. He had burned through nearly 50 test subjects in the process. He meant to keep them all confined at the manor for now. If he needed more for experiments next semester at school, he would catch them then. During the past half semester, he had learned several things about his yin lightning. Like in the game he'd once played, yin lightning in the real world specialized in control. Because his yin lightning had been influenced by the unicorn, thin red filaments wrapped through the lightning and could interact with unusual creatures such as Dementors. The lightning still could not kill Dementors, but those filaments could touch their bodies. When Arthur tested this on captured Dementors, he suspected the effect came from the unicorn's red threads, under the influence of an extremely strong curse, combining with his own soul shell to produce the property. With that insight, he could finally construct a prison for the Dementors. Black Manor had cost him at least 300,000 galleons. Besides the obvious luxuries, a music hall, a banquet hall, several subterranean levels had been built. One basement was a library for dangerous books he'd culled from the House of Black archives. Others were empty. He chose one empty vault, sealed all the Dementors inside, and forged chains of yin lightning to bind them. As a power source, he used the smallest fragment of a philosopher's stone he possessed, converting the stone's magic into his unique lightning to feed the chains. With fewer than 100 Dementors to hold, the fragment's magic should last him more than 10 years. The first reason for confining them was simply to observe whether they could reproduce. He had caught the earliest batch several months earlier, but had seen no sign of activity, perhaps because Dementors have no gender. When Arthur lifted their hoods, he found no genitals. They were all essentially the same, varying only in size and the degree of decay. He had not been idle in his study of them, however. He came to think of Dementors as a special kind of soul, somewhat like the lingering piece of Voldemort's soul he'd seen when Quirrell had been beaten and Voldemort's essence had fled, but stronger. Unlike ghosts, Dementors could interact with the physical world and even consume the souls of other beings. To learn more, Arthur tried killing a few. He summoned unicorns with the Soul Guardian spell and had them trample a couple of Dementors to death. What remained surprised him. The corpses were not bodies at all, but pure fragments of soul energy. They resembled the residue produced when he had destroyed fragments of Voldemort's soul, but where Voldemort's remnants had been a stark white and radiated a perverse sort of purity, the things left by Dementors were black, filled with an oppressive, forbidden power. They made him want to strike them with lightning to scatter them, but his current lightning could not destroy them outright. The unicorns could slowly trample those remnants, but doing so harmed the Soul Guardians themselves, and Arthur did not relish wasting his creatures or his energy. Mostly he left the residues alone. Some of those black fragments, however, dissipated on their own after a few days, which intrigued him. The white remnants from Voldemort's soul had never faded entirely. Some still remained unused in his stores. Arthur also tried to incorporate the Dementor residues into alchemical creations, but unlike Voldemort's residue, which could animate or intelligize tools, the black stuff caused repeated failures. On several occasions when creation should have succeeded, adding the Dementor fragments ruined the process. He tried other tests, shocking them with yang and yin lightning, embedding them into living tissues, and so on. Nothing revealed their nature. The only striking discovery was dangerous. When 7 of the Dementor fragments were piled together, they began to absorb ambient magic and then detonated in a violent explosion. The blast nearly destroyed the Room of Requirement. The room lost most of its functions for a week afterward, Only the control chamber remained accessible. Fortunately, it recovered, or Arthur would have been heartbroken. These results pushed him toward a new theory about Dementors' origins. Historical records put the earliest mention of Dementors on Azkaban when the island had still belonged to a wizard named Extus. Arthur knew Extus as an unspeakable, whose name had been erased from the Ministry's Department of Mysteries. Extus had been studying the curious veil in the Death Chamber. That veil was said to lead directly to the world of death. Any wizard who passed through it was instantly killed. Could that other world of death be the same place Arthur had glimpsed when he once encountered Ravenclaw? Could Dementors be denizens of that realm who slipped into this one through the veil? The notion gained traction when he remembered the cloaked figure he had seen chasing Ravenclaw. The cloak looked similar to those Dementors wore, only less decayed. Once the idea took hold, Arthur stopped his casual experiments and locked the creatures away. He did not yet have the means to explore that other world of death. He would need to master heavenly lightning, lightning capable of directly harming souls, so for now the Dementors would remain imprisoned in Black Manor's depths. The short Christmas holiday ended quickly. During that time, Arthur invited the Malfoys to visit, and Draco's envy of everything in Black Manor was plain to see. Not far from the main gate stood 4 enormous hollow statues, usually guarded by Fudabats, and similar statues punctuated the surrounding walls at regular intervals. That kind of defense was unique. Other pureblood families didn't have anything like it. Lucius was openly impressed. The number of Fudabats under Arthur's command alone could rival most pureblood houses. To be honest, if Draco hadn't learned the Patronus charm, the Malfoys would have struggled to cope with so many of them. Narcissa praised Arthur repeatedly. Not only was he a rare genius, she said, he had also turned her doted-on Draco into a little prodigy, and that made her happiest. Draco, delighted, told Narcissa and Lucius about the 100 points he'd earned for Slytherin, then proceeded to boast extravagantly about his exploits at Hogwarts, so loudly that he almost claimed he was stronger than Dumbledore. Lucius indulged him with a special reward, the newest, fastest broom, a firebolt. Even so, Draco would still have a hard time against Gryffindor in future matches. When the holidays were over, Arthur returned to Hogwarts. Besides practicing his lightning magic, he set himself to mastering another charm, apparition. Similar to teleportation, apparition could be used repeatedly by a skilled wizard, but learning it was notoriously difficult and dangerous. Many had died attempting it. Mastering the charm required 3 things: knowledge of the destination, absolute determination to go there, and calm deliberation while casting. The first step, knowing the destination, meant being intimately familiar with it. The more detailed the mental map, the better. There was also a distance limit that differed from person to person. The farther the jump, the more magical power required, and overextending could be fatal. The second step demanded an iron resolve. Once you decided to go, you had to be unshakable in that decision. The third step, the most crucial, was steadiness of mind while casting. Many witches and wizards, after failing once, were overwhelmed by fear and never succeeded again. If any of those 3 requirements failed, splinching could occur. Part of the body would arrive at the destination while the rest remained behind. While such a fate was nearly always fatal for a muggle, in the wizarding world a non-lethal splinch could be treated, though the recovery was horribly painful and no one volunteered for it. Because apparition carried such risks, many adult wizards, even those who could apparate, preferred safer options for travel: brooms for short distances and portkeys or other enchanted items for longer journeys. For Arthur, however, apparition was not especially difficult. His study of soul magic had heightened his perception to an exceptional degree. He could observe his surroundings with extraordinary detail in a short time. That natural facility meant he could perform the first step, fixing a destination, more reliably than most experienced apparitioners. Within a month, he had mastered the charm to a high degree. Hogwarts, of course, was warded against apparition, so he practiced in the Room of Requirement. By the end of the term, he had even begun to combine apparition with lightning magic. He didn't change the fundamental rules, destination, determination, deliberation, but he augmented the first step, For destination selection, he crafted alchemical devices etched with ancient runes and suffused with lightning magic. These tools were keyed to his perception. Arthur could sense and locate them through magic alone, without seeing them with his eyes. For fun, he called the technique the Flying Thunder God. Beyond the alchemical aids, the lightning magic itself sharpened his spatial perception. When he channeled it, his awareness of unfamiliar surroundings became clear enough to apparat quickly even in combat. Without his tools, though, he still had to visually fix on a destination before jumping. While studying charm work, Arthur continued capturing dementors. He avoided further long-term research into them, but they remained useful. He needed them for his plans regarding the basilisk. Arthur had kept the basilisk alive, not out of fondness for the species, but because its body had valuable properties. Its skin resisted magic better than many dragons, and fangs, gallbladders, and other parts were rare ingredients. Most important of all, its fatal gaze was unique. Until now, he had avoided killing the creature because he didn't want to damage the eyes. With dementors under his command, however, he could attempt to absorb the basilisk's soul directly while leaving its body intact. Training dementors proved difficult. They were not clever. Arthur likened their obedience to that of a dog, and he had to be relentless. He worked them daily until they learned simple commands. He also felt a dark curiosity about whether the basilisk could petrify or kill dementors. Before Arthur could act on those plans, a major event occurred at Hogwarts. Sirius, who had long been dormant, reappeared at the school, and this time he brought Lupin with him. Sirius Black had waited until the end of term to act. He, like Voldemort, preferred to move when Harry Potter's exams were over. He feared that confronting Harry earlier might ruin the boy's performance. Under his arrangement, Crookshanks, Hermione's squashed-faced cat, made the first move. Crookshanks suddenly picked up the trail of a rat that had been allowed to hide for too long. Peter Pettigrew, long disguised as Ron's mangy rat Scabbers, scurried for his life. Sirius could no longer wait. He was terrified Pettigrew would slip away when Ron went home for the holidays. So the chase began. The rat ran, the cat pursued, and the four students, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Scabbers' owner, followed, racing out toward the edge of the grounds. They reached the Homping Willow, where a low, hidden passage lay in the shadows. A large black dog watched them from within. Scabbers darted for cover among the bushes, trying to dodge both cat and dog. Ron, furious, kicked at the black dog, scooped up his rat, and stuffed him into his robes. To Ron's relief, Scabbers went limp in his arms, obedient as always. Ron felt the creature trembling and drew his wand, glaring at the dog with murderous intent. The dog stared back with equal intensity. Then, in an instant, it lunged. It bit Ron and tore at his upper body. Sirius Black had lost all restraint. He had spent nearly a year trying and failing to get at Pettigrew. Now that the end of term had come, he would do anything to force him to answer, even if others were hurt. Harry and Hermione rushed in, kicking and scrambling at the dog, but afraid to use powerful charms for fear of hitting Ron. A few minutes later, Professor Lupin arrived and stopped the struggle. Seeing the dog and the rat, he instantly guessed much of what had happened. Sirius turned back into a man, and, after a quick, tense exchange with Lupin, the truth spilled out. Years ago, the Potters had hidden themselves with the Fidelius charm. Sirius had been their secret keeper, but he feared he would be the obvious choice, so he persuaded Peter Pettigrew, someone no one would suspect, to take the secret. Pettigrew betrayed them to Voldemort. When Sirius confronted him, Pettigrew mutilated his hand and fled, framing Sirius for the murders. Harry and Hermione were stunned into silence. Ron was incredulous. No way. Scabbers? He's been with me for years. He's just a rat. Lupin, with a few swift words and a flick of his wand, forced the little creature to change. The rat shrank and twisted into a small, ugly man with rat-like features. Peter Pettigrew, thought dead for 12 years. Ron immediately retched and pressed his hands to his mouth, sick and humiliated at what he had slept with and bathed and even kissed. Sirius sprang at Pettigrew, claws out, ready to tear him apart. Harry grabbed him. "I don't think my father would want you to be a murderer," Harry said, voice trembling. "He wouldn't want you to be sent to Azkaban for killing someone who betrayed his friends." Harry's words calmed Sirius a little, but Lupin was not calm. He had rushed out without taking his wolfsbane potion, and it was the night of the full moon. The potion should have kept him from changing. In the confusion, he hadn't remembered to drink it. He staggered, and his features began to twist. His eyes reddened. "Run! Get away! Run!" Lupin's words were slurred, and his face was already hardening. As he transformed, Sirius flipped back into a great black dog and leapt at him, trying to hold him down so Lupin couldn't bite or infect anyone. In the scuffle, Pettigrew vanished, turning into a rat and slipping away through the roots and tunnels. Harry and Hermione saw him go, but had no chance to pursue. Lupin was stronger than Sirius, and he broke free. "Get Harry! Go find Dumbledore!" Sirius snarled, pushing Harry and the others away. Lupin, now a full werewolf, swiped with a huge paw. Sirius was hurled against the humping willow and sent flying, and the tree lashed him again. Sirius fell to the ground, spitting blood. Lupin howled at the full moon and charged the students. Harry flung out an Expelliarmus. The red jet struck Lupin but had no effect. Lupin rubbed the spot and lunged at Harry. As he braced for the attack, a sharp sound rang out and a thin, painful charm struck Lupin's raised arm. He yelped and covered himself, retreating. A black figure stepped between them. "Snape?" Harry breathed without thinking. "Call me Professor Potter," Snape said coldly, voice full of scorn. "And don't call me a savior." Harry's relief at being saved was complicated. He looked at Snape with conflicted gratitude. "Yes, Professor Snape?" Fury and pain had made the werewolf more feral. Lupin's eyes were bloodshot. He glared hatefully at Snape, whose face went hard as something displeasing must have occurred to him. Snape leveled his wand at Lupin. "Accio!" Harry grabbed Snape's arm. "Professor, that's Professor Lupin!" "So?" Snape shrugged off Harry's hand. "You should have known this already, Potter. You've been attending his classes all term. If you had paid attention months ago, I wouldn't have had to come and find you now." He snapped the words like a whip, then cast a bright red charm that struck Lupin's eyes. The pain, first the cut to his arm, now his sight, sobered Lupin enough for him to look at Harry and, with a last torn glance at Sirius, turn and stumble away toward the forbidden forest. Behind him, a battered black dog and a cat vanished into the trees. Snape looked furious and not a little shaken. He had been annoyed with Lupin earlier that evening and had intended to deliver the wolfsbane potion, but he hadn't found him in his office. He had searched the school with growing alarm. If Lupin changed inside the castle and bit anyone, the consequences would be catastrophic. When he heard the howl, he had come running. Now, after seeing the mangled scene and learning the black dog's true identity, he nearly bit the wand out of his own hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" he barked at Harry. "Do you know Sirius Black is a dangerous fugitive? You should not simply trust him. You take after your father, arrogant, foolish, and soft-headed like a troll." His voice was venomous. "Gryffindor, 20 points for not recognizing your teacher's condition. Another 40 for withholding information about Sirius Black." Harry felt crushed. Snape had just saved them, but his gratitude evaporated under the stinging insult. Hermione, recovering faster than either boy, seized Harry and Ron by the arms. They couldn't stay out here. If Lupin transformed again, they'd be done for. They had to return to the castle at once.